Okay, friends, I have got myself a warm cup of coffee. I'm trying to make myself comfortable talking about an uncomfortable topic, which is our friend Saturn and the sign of Cancer. So the way that I'm going to approach this talk, I'm going to give you guys an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm also going to give you guys some personal stories because yours truly here has the signature in her charts. So I'm familiar with it, and in having read a lot of charts and having a lot of peers who have the signature in their charts, I'm fairly familiar with it. And in this video, at some point, I'm going to start making some connection with the ruler of Cancer, which is also Moon. We have to also take that into consideration. We can't just universalize certain significations as this is what is always going to happen when Saturn is in Cancer or any planet in any sign. We have to look at the totality of the charts. But I'll try to contextualize that as much as possible as we go along. But just to give you guys the outline first, so I'm going to talk about some early childhood development and psychological themes. Then we're going to talk about the outcome of these developments in adulthood, and especially in relationship context. And then I'm going to conclude this talk with what Saturn and Cancer natives can do in a healing journey. Because this signature by itself can indicate trauma. It can indicate a lot of repression and suppression of emotions and feelings that become great obstacles in life that one has to work through. So when we talk about Saturn and Cancer, one of the common themes that comes out of it is talking about very complex relational dynamics within that native's life. And these experiences in childhood actually leaves a particular kind of a psychological pattern within these natives. And often it's deeply rooted in not having emotional security in life. So with that in mind, let's go and look at the particularities of certain struggles that can come up for these natives. One of the first things that we can look at with a person with this kind of a signature in their chart is to look at their attachment style in general, in terms of their attachment style in context of different relationships. And our attachment style has a lot to do with the way we emotionally develop in our early childhood. For example, Saturn and Cancer people, they may have experienced a lot of dysfunctional familial dynamics in their early childhood. And there was a lack of emotional safety. And when there's lack of emotional safety and you can't anchor yourself, the kind of emotional attachment that psychologists attach to this is called disorganized attachment style. And this makes it very hard for these natives to navigate intimate relational dynamic that require closeness and a lot of warmth to make them functional. So let's just take a minute to understand what this disorganized attachment style is and how it's related to Saturn and Cancer. So to understand this disorganized attachment style, we have to look at the root cause of it, which is generally related to how the child is able to form a strong and a warm and a connective bond with their primary caregiver. Now, the caregiver could be the mother, which historically generally has been, even today. Even though the numbers are starting to even out, there are more mothers who are the primary caregivers than fathers. But fathers could be in that role, grandparents could be in that role, whoever it is that's giving that primary caregiving. And in general, the sign of Cancer is denoting the family. So the whole family dynamic as a whole also. So our primary caregiver is supposed to give us emotional comfort, but the disorganized attachment style is denoting that the primary caregiver is actually a source of fear for the child. There's unpredictability or emotional volatility in that relationship. So the child's innate ability to establish secure attachments is compromised. And with Saturn in Cancer, this becomes very prevalent. And why is that? Because Cancer represents family, domestic environments, emotions, our deep feelings, deep desires, deep opinions, is the depth of our interiority and what's within us. That's what Cancer represents. It's about our emotional security and the deep foundations that are required for a person to feel secure. Now, when we look at Saturn, Saturn in general is going to be at conflict with the sign of Cancer when we take its significations and symbols into consideration. For example, Saturn represents negativity, detachment, rejection, restriction, distance, coldness, criticism. And in general, it's related to all kinds of scarcity and fears that we have stemming from Saturn's significations. So this archetype is creating a paradox within the child's and his, her, or their psyche. So the child goes to the parents, to the family dynamic, to the primary caregiver, and is looking for warmth, is looking for secure attachment. It's looking for a feedback that validates its own being. And what they get as a feedback is coldness, a sense of detachment. So there's this feeling of unsettlement within the child from the get-go. There's a sense of fear, of not belonging, of not being taken care of. So that security paradigm turns into insecurity paradigm when Saturn's in Cancer. And in this way, the child ends up in a confusing dilemma. It's that it's always longing for this connection and the security and the warmth. And then it comes to simultaneously fear it, because every time it's seeking it, it's kind of being rejected. It's not being reciprocated. So it creates all of these tension points within the child. And it's this that starts to contribute to the development of that disorganized attachment style. Because there is no consistent way of forming relationships that feel emotionally predictable and safe. The parent could be very volatile, for example. If they're in a good mood, they validate and acknowledge your being. If they are not in a good mood, they can't regulate their own emotions to be able to give that kind of a feedback to the child when it needs it. So there's this instability. It's not a secure environment. Sorry, I have something in my eye. Worst timing right at the beginning. So in this way, the Saturn in Cancer child grows up with a lot of mixed messages. Like one moment, the caregiver is nurturing, is attentive, they're there, they're warm. And the next moment, they're just emotionally absent or just volatile. So in a sense, it's a very chaotic situation for a child and a child's mind to make sense of this in terms of like, how do I behave? When do I ask for something? When do I cry? When do I laugh? It creates a lot of conundrum within the child. There's a lot of, again, unpredictability. And this unpredictability often leads to a kind of an ambivalence, which is just as a human being, we all do. We all have a deep need for closeness, belonging, and intimacy. But for a Saturn and Cancer person, while they have this deep need and desire, which, as I was saying earlier, the sign of Cancer represents our deep needs and desires, they fear it. So there's also a deep sense of fear about intimacy, warmth, and closeness. To just give an example, imagine a child where their parents just keep oscillating between warm and cold, cold and warm. One day they're affectionate and they're holding the child close and they're being super attentive. And the next day, for whatever reason that's happening in their own life, they completely neglect the child's needs. And they might even react with anger, that volatility that can come out. In the mind of the child, this creates a lot of internal volatility. It actually creates confusion for them. And it's not uncommon for them to come to have this belief that love and connection is conditional and unstable. And again, this is the ambivalence, right? Because they crave closeness, because that's just the nature of being human. We want that, we need that, we desire that. And yet, there's this fear of rejection that's being cultivated in the child, which is coming from that inconsistency and this inability to gauge other people's emotions in terms of how they need to behave, because how they behave doesn't get the proper reaction. Now, before talking about other factors that can come into this childhood paradigm, we should also right now talk about how this can actually carry over to adulthood, what its outcome and manifestations look like. And usually the carryover becomes very apparent when the Saturn Cancer person finds themselves in intimate relationships where they have to be very close and they can't use their own emotional distance as a defense mechanism anymore. One of the things that will come out of this, it's very common with Saturn and Cancer individuals, it's extreme hypervigilance. And this is the result of that early childhood conditioning. This is because they constantly had to gauge the emotional responses and the states of their caregiver to be able to navigate their own emotional safety. And this hypervigilance, when you look at psychological literature, is actually related to trauma. It is something that causes trauma, is underlying trauma. And they call this kind of trauma CPTSD, which is a complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And this kind of trauma is related to emotional neglect. But this has a protective mechanism for the child when they're growing up. It's a mechanism that's trying to protect them from the harm that can arise from very unpredictable and tumultuous emotional environments. So this hypervigilance is actually helping the natives to anticipate what's going to come up next, how other people are going to react to them. And it's a way of mitigating emotional volatility and unpredictability in other people. So it's a way of self-regulating one's own emotion by being hyper vigilant, super observant of what other people are doing. It's almost like the attention and the inner focus is just externalized and put onto other people. This has a problem, right? Because it's hard for us to split our attention. Like, for example, right now, as I'm talking to you, I'm giving all of my attention to this presentation. I have a ton of other things I have to do, but I can't split my attention to that. I'm having a hard time gauging my own, let's say, internal happenings as I'm externalizing my attention. So this hypervigilance that's externally oriented and is trying to gauge everything outside makes the person or conditions the person to kind of become unaware of their own feelings and what is happening within themselves. This is a problem with hypervigilance. And just to give an example, imagine a Saturn Cancer person is entering a relationship, like a love relationship, romantic one. On the surface, they're going to appear easygoing, adaptable, compromising, all the good qualities that we want in a partner in a relationship. But internally, if you were to go inside their head, they're often monitoring the other partner, their mood, how their behavior changes from one moment to the next moment. I just gave a thumbs up by accident. And in turn, because they've been conditioned, they're going to constantly alter their own behavior and their own ways of being to accommodate the partner. And all of this is to prevent conflict, is to create some sort of an equilibrium that feels secure and predictable. And this often comes at the expense of their own needs. I remember this one time I was sitting with my younger cousins. We were sitting in the back of a car, and one of them, she was speaking to me, and I thought I was just being normal, but she goes, "You know what? You remind me of Kodak." And I was like, "What's Kodak?" She's like, "I don't know. There's something about your eyes. I just feel like it's like a frame that's just like taking photos." I was very observant of her because that hypervigilance, it feels passive to the person who is hypervigilant, who is observing everything, but it's just literally taking the frames of everything and just subconsciously assessing it. You know, this does have an upside in a sense. You become very good at reading people, situations, circumstances. And I feel that when a person resolve certain conflicts within themselves, this is actually one of the superpowers of Saturn in Cancer, because they can sit with another person, they can hold all of their negative feelings and emotions, and at the same time, because they're observing them and what's happening, they can understand what kind of fluctuations they're going through. They become very well versed in human psychology and how people behave and shift and what are the trigger points. But as we'll see in a second, this creates a lot of problems in the natives that they have to come to understand about themselves, because they become good at managing other people's emotion, but not necessarily good at managing their own emotion. Because I was saying that they externalize that attention and they lose sight of how they feel, what they need, what's good for their own emotional well-being. And this is burdensome because you become the emotional regulators of other people. And if you are a Saturn in Cancer person, or you know one of the things that you will notice about them, they are the people within the group dynamic where everyone comes to talk about their problems. Yes, they may be good problem solvers because of some other signature in their chart, But it's also because they are so good at regulating other people's emotions. They know how to act and react in relation to what the other person's saying in order to maintain a certain state of being or a certain emotion, or to do something to trigger the other person to, let's say, elevate their mood and to bring about more positive feelings, for example. They can also use that on the other end of the spectrum. A Saturn in Cancer person can walk into a room where it's boiling hot and they can make it into a huge ice cube too. They have this ability to do this with other people, to other people, or for other people. But the thing is, when you do that, you can't truly be yourself and express yourself and have a sense of personhood in a relationship, because you come to just have your entire focus on the other person. It's hard to be the self as one is, as how one feels in a relational dynamic when someone's operating from this premise. And all of this, everything that I discussed so far, creates problems with being able to regulate their own fears, because fear is a state of being and it's an emotion. We have to be aware of it, to be proactive. Sometimes to deal with our emotion is to choose ourselves, even if someone else doesn't like it in that moment. But the Saturn in Cancer person has not only problem with confronting and feeling their own fears in an explicit way where they can deal with it, they also have a fear of abandonment. So in order not to be abandoned, they can do an elaborate song and dance and stay in relationships that are absolutely dysfunctional, just not to confront that fear and not to be abandoned. And you can see this in a life of Saturn Cancer individuals. And you'll see that they're even drawn to people that are emotionally unstable, for example. They're unavailable, they're distant, volatile, or cold. All of it is echoing the kinds of dynamics that they had experienced in the past, and they're just recreating those. There's a familiarity with it. If you've been conditioned to do something over and over, that's the way that you perceive and understand the world. This is kind of hard to accept, but when you have spent a couple of decades of your life, let's say, externalizing your attention and putting all of your energy and life force on other people and not having that on yourself, it actually makes it very painful to have a moment where you have to go internal. It's going to feel very unfamiliar. So the first response to that discomfort, that inner discomfort that comes, is to recreate a situation, for example, where you can be in that circumstance where you're comfortable again. So this is one of the reasons why they tend to gravitate towards partners who recreate these modes and ways of being, because they're going back to what they themselves are comfortable with, the way that they've been conditioned. And the crazy thing is, people from the outside can see the chaos. Often they can see the chaos. But for the Saturn in Cancer person, it actually feels normal. And another thing that I've seen over and over, it's not uncommon for Saturn in Cancer people to end up with very chaotic personalities, and even people with personality disorders like narcissism, with narcissists, with borderlines, and people who have psychopathic traits. Because these people demand the entirety of your attention. They cannot regulate their own emotions. They actually will use other people to have emotional regulation. And Saturn Cancer persons very good at doing this. So they are the prime, let's call them victims here, because they're sought out for that purpose. And the Saturn in Cancer person is not fully a victim, because they'll give into this and they'll go into these relational dynamics because that is their comfort zone. That is their normalcy. So let's just consider an example. So Saturn Cancer person gets into a relationship with a person who's constantly going from warm to cold. Emotionally, they're attentive. Emotionally, they're neglectful. 1 minute they're present. Next thing you know, they're packing their things up to leave and to go. So there's a lot of instability in that relationship. Again, while others will see red flag all over these kinds of behavior, Saturn in Cancer person, it will take a lot at the beginning for them to understand that this is not normal. And they'll actually stay in such relationship for years. In a way, the Saturn Cancer person has developed such a thick skin for instability, insecurity, fear, rejection, that what another person would just, they would break, Saturn and Cancer person is just another day at the office. So their tolerance, their endurance for emotional up and down is a lot. And the part that needs to be realized is that in the initial stage of life, without enough life experiences, they might actually misinterpret this volatility for intimacy, for passion, for connection. So these are the life lessons that a Saturn in Cancer person has to learn to be able to differentiate and distinguish, even though the internal feeling of it might be lacking. And they have to recondition themselves and their minds to be able to have a different perception. Yeah, and then to stay on this relationship topic, with this signature in a chart, you can also have repetition compulsion. So they have reoccurring relationship, as I was saying, over and over, they find themselves in the same relationship dynamic with those kinds of behaviors. And repetition compulsion is a term that was introduced by Sigmund Freud. And what he was trying to say is that those early patterns and conditionings that we have create an unconscious drive in us to repeat those situations of the childhood again in adulthood. And we do this as a way to resolve them, not because we're insane. We're actually trying to find a solution to those initial childhood conditioning and the way that they were problematic and the pain that they caused. So in this way, the person goes out in the world, finds a person that's very much like their primary caregiver and the family members that they were closest to, in an effort to change the outcome of that situation in order to resolve it. Mind you, though, I would say 99.9% of the time unsuccessfully. Because the kind of relationships that they seek and where they end up, those people are not able to give them that security paradigm, the intimacy that they need, the warmth, the connectivity, the belonging, acceptance, consistency. And in general, let's just call it love. They go for people who are having a difficulty themselves in having these feelings within themselves. How could someone give you what they themselves don't have? So this is another thing that Saturn and Cancer people have to come to realize and start grappling with. Like, it is not uncommon for Saturn and Cancer people to be with neglectful and exploitative partners. And they try. If you pay attention to their relationship, they're really trying to solve a riddle. Everyone's telling them, like, get the hell out. What are you doing? This is not even worth it. Look what the persons keep doing. Look at where you're constantly finding yourself or how your life is declining. But they're just in a mode like, I need to resolve this. I need to solve this solution. I know we can do better. I know he or she can do better. So it's very deeply entrenched. And they basically, let's say the mother was an unavailable mother. A mother was a volatile mother. A mother was a cold mother. They end up finding partners that have great resemblance to that primary caregiver. It's kind of funny. They think to themselves, if I can make this distant and a cold partner a little bit warmer, a little bit closer, then I can finally achieve security and acceptance and inclusion. And these are usually happening subconsciously. It's not like the person saying these things out loud to them. If I can do this and if I can bring this out in the other person, then I can feel this. But this is the underlying script that's happening in the background. Like, imagine this. The Saturn in Cancer person, which, as I said earlier, they are prone to this. They end up with a narcissist. what does the narcissist do? There's that love bombing stage, right? So there's all of this flattery, there's all of this compliments, affection, warmth. I'm just taking you into my worlds. They even create a fantasy and they want you to come into this fantasy world, and together we're going to do this. We're going to be a power couple and we're going to be larger than life, and you're the greatest thing since sliced bread. To a Saturn in Cancer person who has not experienced this, for example, right? And this is exactly what they're seeking to have. This is what they missed in their childhood, that validation, that acknowledgement, that warmth, that closeness, the inclusion. So now comes the narcissist giving them all of this. But that's not who the narcissist is. So once when they idealized you, once when they brought you into their shared fantasy, they are going to devalue you, and eventually they are going to discard you. So emotional neglect, very common with a narcissist. Denying sex to their partner, very common in narcissistic behavior. Intimacy will go out the door, volatility will enter. Manipulative behaviors like gaslighting will come into the forefront. And the Saturn in Cancer person's like, but babe, but I thought we were going to do that in life, and that's how we feel about each other. And the narcissist is basically discarding the person. So they're constantly devaluing them, which is rejecting them, becoming cold. Everything that the Saturn in Cancer person has come to fear, and the rejection itself is happening right in front of their eyes. And a lot of people with this signature will stay, endure the hardship of these relationships, and all as an attempt to resolve some pasthood trauma, as if they have the power, which is kind of arrogance to think that you have the power to, let's say, change a narcissist. It's a personality disorder, and you're merely a human being trying to live your life without the tools and the equipment. And there are even some psychologists that say that they cannot be fixed. So here's a Saturn in Cancer person thinking that they can make them loving and warm and inclusive and stable, but it just doesn't fly. And of course, as I said, 99% of, let's say, narcissists in our example will leave and reject the Saturn in Cancer person, and they are now standing there facing that, the very thing that they feared the most, and also feeling like a failure because they are so good at being hyper-vigilant, but they couldn't figure out the narcissist. They're so good at regulating other people's emotion, but they couldn't regulate the fantasy and the emotion of the narcissist. So it cuts deep. And you know what? Sometimes I feel that we meet certain people in life with certain qualities, because as painful and as hard as it is to be with that person, it requires that much for us to come to ourselves and be like, wait a minute. Why was I trying to make this effort with this person? What about me? So to take that focus that the Saturn in Cancer person externalizes and gives to other people, as painful as it is, in such a circumstance, when that rejection hurts so bad, they have to take that focus, put it back on the inside, and examine those early caregivers, to examine the patterns that were established within them, to just trace everything back to see, how is it that it led up to this? Why do I feel this hurt? Why do I have these thoughts and these feelings? To get back to that Cancerian mode of, what are my deepest desires? How do I feel? What do I need? So it takes you to that introspective mode, finally, certain relationships and certain life situations in general. It takes you back to that Cancerian depth to be able to ponder and figure things out. So I'm saying that because life can be unkind in a lot of ways to all of us. And for Saturn and Cancer people, it hits where it hurts, which is with our emotions, right? Which is with our feelings and our desires and not having our needs met. So I think the ability to come back and to be able to figure things out, sometimes it requires some big things happening to us, but we'll continue and perhaps talk about that at the end. The point here is that compulsion to keep repeating things, perhaps, I don't know, it brings the person back to this self-reflective mode. But if it doesn't, that compulsion just continues and it just becomes a lifetime of going from one partner that induces the same kind of feelings and feelings of failure. Saturn is a planet that signifies failures. So it just becomes a loop, and the individual is not able to change those early patterns in their life to be able to do better in the preceding relationships. And it's important to remember that this is not happening on a conscious level. So you can't look at a Saturn and Cancer person and be like, stop doing that. These are not conscious level processings. These are very subconscious. They're even unconscious because they're just our mental patterns. They're the impressions that are left on our mind. And that's how the pathways on our mind is carved, and we move that way. We move through those pathways, and we all have them for better and for worse. It's just that the Saturn and Cancer person has to realize that they can't recreate the past in order to overcome the trauma. They have to carve out new pathways, and it comes through being self-reflective, doing a lot of self-inventory, a lot of soul-searching and self-understanding. That's the way that it comes about. Like those childhood heartbreaks, disappointments, and wounds will not heal through this method, which is it's a very prominent experience with this signature. I'll talk about more about the path to healing at the end, but I want to go through a couple more points about childhood occurrences and what happens. Another thing that happens in childhood that's prominent with Saturn and Cancer people is parentification and fawning, which is a form of parentification. And this is a coping mechanism that the Saturn and Cancer person will develop. So when a child is experiencing all of this volatility, unpredictability, lack of connection, warmth, that security paradigm is violated, the child themselves find themselves in the position of a caretaker. And this process is known as parentification. It involves a child either parentifying themselves because the parents are not regulating their emotions or not creating that stability. The child has to figure out in their child's mind how to do that for themselves. Or taking that hypervigilance again, the child comes to be the one who's regulating the parents' emotions in order to create some sort of a stability for themselves. So they become either the caretaker or the caregiver. And this is all because the primary caregivers and the family couldn't be emotionally available for the child. And this is not, when you pay attention, when I look at even my own experiences, it wasn't only about parentification in terms of how do I take care of myself and what do I have to do for others in the family to be stable and to be consistent, but was also about becoming an emotional buffer and a peacekeeper for the rest of the family. I mean, up to recent years, I called myself the bridge maker or the bridge for the family. Just the primary goal was to maintain the peace and stability between all the family members, even at the cost of all emotional pains that will come with it. And this is very prominent for Saturn and Cancer people. And over time, this leads to the development of another psychological phenomenon, which they call it fawn. It's a fawn response, not fun, fawn as in F-A-W-N. And it's actually a recognized trauma response because we have trauma responses are fight, flight, freeze, fawn. Fawning involves putting other people's needs first and before our own. It's self-sacrificing for other people to ensure safety and to ensure conflict is minimized. For example, because of that hypervigilance that I was explaining, a Saturn and Cancer child, right away, they will notice that mother is stressed. Mother's emotionally being unpredictable and she's overwhelmed. I got to do something. In response, I mean, in reality, someone needs to be attending right now to the child's emotion, but the child is going through their mind. The wheel is going at 300 miles an hour, trying to figure out, how do I comfort mother or my primary caregiver or someone else in the family right now? So what does this mean? They have a need in that moment. They have a feeling, they have an emotion, but they have to suppress their own in order to be able to attend to the need of another person. A Saturn and Cancer person will always opt out in comforting other people than in comforting themselves first. This is a life lesson for Saturn and Cancer people. Put the oxygen mask on yourself before you give it to someone else, because there will come a situation in life where you'll see that someone that you love and care about beside you is dying, but you have nothing left in you to give. And you're actually jeopardizing everything that you care about. So this becomes a theme, a life lesson for Saturn and Cancer people. And like one of the primary themes is that Saturn and Cancer people as children will try to be the ideal child for the mother, for the caregiver, for the family. Never complain, be quiet. When they tell you to sit, you sit. When they tell you to roll over, you roll over. Always be supportive, always be in the supportive role. Keep yourself in the background. Don't shine too much. This is Saturn, right? And Cancer is about feelings. Suppress the feelings, suppress your own needs and desires. And the essence of the fawn response is self-sacrifice to maintain the harmony and the stability and the solidness of your surrounding. And then the thing is that these childhood patterns of parentification and fawning will carry over to adulthood again. It's not like something that happens in childhood and we just leave it back there. It becomes a way that we navigate relationships as adults. As an adult, we tend to become the emotional caretaker and caregiver of other people when it's not even our business. We become that for our romantic partners. And as I was saying, the irony is that the signature is saying you could very well find someone who's emotionally volatile and who can't do that for you. So when it becomes a one-way road, it becomes even more difficult to constantly make yourself available for another person and to give of yourself. And in return, your cup is not being full. It's just constantly being emptied out. It's an emotional drainage. And in essence, in childhood, this was a survival mechanism, right? Because we had to regulate mother, caregiver, and the family's states of being to create stability and to have a sense of security and to cope with that fear that we were constantly feeling. It's a strategy. It's a survival strategy. In the person's mind, the stability of the relationship is dependent on the degree they're able to regulate other people's emotions, which always comes at the cost of suppressing and repressing their own emotions and needs and desires, which Cancer also signifies. Like, for example, imagine an adult in a relationship, again, with a person who's cold, who's distant, who refuses to be intimate. They're just unavailable in general. And instead of in that moment recognizing, look, this makes me feel a certain way. And in order for me to have a sense of stability and to actually feel good, I need to do A and B for myself. Not for Cancer, a Saturn and Cancer person. They will prioritize the need of the partner in that moment. They're going to go out of their way to comfort them. What's wrong with you? What can I do for you? Which is essentially trying to alter the emotional state of the partner to feel a sense of stability and security and to have safety. And this dynamic is exhausting and it's unsustainable. But to a Saturn and Cancer person's mind, it's natural and normal again. The urge to solve the emotional instability of other people has been conditioned and ingrained. And it's a compulsion in them to maintain harmony and safety by constantly sacrificing their own needs and what they need to actually have a sense of well-being. It is not uncommon for Saturn and Cancer people to feel completely emotionally depleted, empty, and dried. And it's because of this behavior that they themselves are doing. This is a life lesson again. We as Saturn and Cancer people, we need to figure out like not to do this, to recognize it first and foremost, and to start conditioning the mind to put new imprints and pathways to say, okay, I'm feeling emotionally drained. I don't have to attend to this person in this manner. They're an adult. They're not my child. They're an adult. I'm not going to be their parents. They can take care of this for now. And I'm so drained. What do I need to do right now to replenish myself, even if this person can't do it right now? Hopefully it's a healthy relationship and eventually they will. They're just having a bad day. But just in general, as a kind of a self-awareness. And let me see something. The next point is we have to talk about the self-perception of the Saturn in Cancer, which is about unworthiness, struggling and grappling with this notion of self-worth. And if one feels that they are not worthy, if they are not good enough, what always follows is, am I good enough to be with? So that fear of abandonment that I was discussing earlier gets intensified with this feeling of worthlessness that Saturn in Cancer can create. And Saturn represents dirtiness, griminess. Whenever we're insecure, whenever we feel like I am worthless, I have no value, this is Saturn's archetype at play. So now it's sitting in the sign of Cancer. It has to do with all of our internal processing. And how do we assess our self-worth? Our true self-worth is actually not what we have externally, who we are externally, what kind of status. It literally comes down to the actual perception that we have of ourselves, and we're able to internalize that perception. Saturn Cancer people will have a bit of a difficulty. I'm going to go take a little bit of break. I even forgot to have some coffee. I'll come back and we'll discuss the self-perception, unworthiness, and fear of abandonment. Just coming back from the break, I was thinking about how Saturn represents outcasts. So not feeling belonging. And as a child, you can't gauge yourself either externally. So that comes to contribute to the sense of like, what is my worth? Am I worthy? Am I good enough? Not to mention with all of the things that we already discussed. But let us continue. I feel so serious. I guess because I'm talking about Saturn and Cancer, I feel like I need to lighten up on the inside. But anyways, let's continue. So going back to that self-perception, a lot of it has to do with lack of emotional attunement, which has to come from that caregiver or that familial environment that we're in childhood to feel loved. Like, how do you get emotionally attuned if the response to you was cold, detached, volatile, unstable? Those kinds of things actually give the Saturn in Cancer child's messages of unworthiness. Like the child is expressing a desire or an emotion and it's receiving coldness and indifference, let's say, that Saturnine quality. So the child's needs, desires, and emotions are not worthy of attention and validation, acknowledgement, for example. So this gets internalized. It's almost as if like, I'm not deserving of love and care as a child, because the child's mind interprets things different than our adult minds. It's working on this extreme polarity. If something is and something is not, it's very black and white. You know, it's like splitting. When you're older, you don't do that anymore. You can see the shades of gray. You can see nuances. You can hold two contradictory ideas at the same time. As a child, you can't do that yet because your brain hasn't developed in that way. So it's like, I feel this thing, you go with excitement to express it, hold indifference. Oh, so that thing's not important. I feel that. It's not acknowledged. I'm not important. This is how a child interprets things. And this becomes a prominent theme in a Saturn Cancer person's life as a child. And we talk about self-love a lot in our today's society. And self-love is cultivated, is learned. And the first lessons, the primary lessons have to come from the caregivers and from the family. The child needs to feel love, to understand what love is in order to internalize it and have that sense for itself. And this is what creates that sense of worthiness that I exist. My existence matters. I am loved. I am secured in the hearts of other people. This stabilizes a person in themselves. That it gives a person a sense of personhood and self-worth. Saturn negates this. And Saturn's negating this through the family dynamics and through the primary caregivers. And I keep saying, Cancer in itself doesn't represent the primary caregiver like a mother or a parent. The moon does that. But who's the ruler of Cancer? It is the moon. That's why we have to look at where the moon is sitting. We'll talk about that more towards the end of the video. And this perception of, let's say, I am not worthy, I'm not good enough, which is essentially, it's translating as I can't care about myself, I can't trust myself, and it's creating fears of I'm not good enough to be loved. I'm not good enough to trust myself. I'm not capable of doing a lot of things, because our self-esteem and our capacity to be able to act in the world, so much of it is about having this sense of self-worth, trusting ourselves that we can act in the world. So all of these things are being negated with this signature to different degrees, because everyone's chart's different. And it's exactly this pervasive feeling of I'm not good enough that actually attaches itself to fear of abandonment. Who wants to be with someone who's not good enough? And we come to see this in the mate selection later in life, in adulthood, because it's not just like the narcissist or the problematic person is choosing the Saturn in Cancer person, but that person is also eyeing such people. Eyeing people not because they will abandon them per se, but it's like, can I be with someone better than this person? That requires a degree of self-worth. Like, I have this value and I need to be treated well. So I need to be with this person who can treat other people well. But when you don't have that sense of self-worth as a Saturn and Cancer person, you may go with suboptimal partners because you're not good enough to be with someone who's actually loving and caring and who will reciprocate what you bring to the relationship also. Like, because of this feeling of unworthiness and I'm not good enough, Saturn and Cancer people, and Saturn's endurance too, right? So they can cling on to these toxic relationships that they get into for years on end. And essentially, the fear is now, like, subconsciously, you know that this is a suboptimal person. But imagine even being abandoned now by a suboptimal person. The fear that that will induce. There's already fear of abandonment. There's already that feeling of not feeling secured and anchored. And now even the suboptimal person might leave you. And it's overwhelming. And this is one of the reasons why they end up staying in relationships that are damaging. And they prefer to stay in these damaging relationships than to have it to come to a point where the suboptimal person abandons them, because it's going to validate that unworthy feeling that was already there. And you know what? No human being likes the feeling of abandonment. And all of us, it creates a feeling of emptiness, a void. There's a particular kind of a pain when, let's say, someone in a relationship abandons ship and just leaves. But for a person who's struggling with a feeling of worth, self-worth, they feel unworthy, the kind of emptiness that comes out of that is intolerable. It's encompassing everything that was part of their childhood experience. It's not just that incidence in itself. So this is another reason why this people with this signature will stay in relationship, to avoid arriving to that moment and that confrontation with life and with the inner self and the past, the entirety of one's childhood, to that moment of experience. In some ways, it's easier to be in an intolerable relationship than to look at the formulation of those false beliefs that have been entrenched in the mind about I'm not good enough and I'm unworthy. And for good reasons too. It's painful. It's just the person has to have the readiness to arrive in that moment and to be able to confront that intense moment in life. And again, going back to the topics already discussed, This feeling of unworthiness can get even more intensified because you don't want to feel the abandonment. You don't want to intensify this feeling of unworthiness because of abandonment. The Saturn and Cancer person will even overextend themselves even a little bit more to accommodate their partner's need at the expense of their own. They will even self-sabotage and make sure that they fail, as Saturn represents failure, to satisfy the partner. If you're with a narcissist, for example, you have got to nurse their ego. You cannot be better. Saturn and Cancer person will destroy their own lives to be able to accommodate that feeling, for example, for the narcissist, just to maintain this relationship so that they don't have to face these end products that will force them to take their externalized attention back inside of themselves to that introspective mode to face themselves, which again is difficult till a person's ready to do it. And staying in these kinds of relationship where you feel unworthy and there's so much fear of abandonment and you put up with a lot of, excuse my French, shit, it's an abusive relationship. Emotionally, at the least is emotionally abusive. Like a person who doesn't see your self-worth, for example, will not hesitate to belittle you, to make comments that make you feel smaller than, for example. They're not going to hesitate to ignore, to be self-serving at your expense. So these are very unhealthy dynamics. And the Saturn and Cancer person will often stay because they need to prove their worth, that I am worthy enough, and that this partner will eventually reciprocate and accept me and love me, going back to that compulsion repetition, trying to get a different outcome, but it's very unlikely that it will give a different outcome, right? And in essence, these kinds of behaviors actually intensifies those initial carvings and pathways. It will intensify the pain over the years. And it's reinforcing false beliefs about one's own worth. And a person can actually arrive to a point in life where they consciously have a thought of, I am not deserving of genuine affection, that I am bad. And again, going back to that narcissistic relationship, narcissists don't have external object relation. They're only in relationship with themselves. And they always see the partner, especially when it comes to that devaluing and discarding them, as a bad object. So they're going to make sure an abusive partner, even if they're not a narcissist, they will make sure at the end, they're not going to leave peacefully and say, look, we really tried. And on some level, I love you and I care about you, but we just can't make it work. An abusive person and a narcissist, because they devalue and need to discard and go to the next person, for example, they will go out of their way to make you feel small and to make you feel unworthy. And if this gets internalized by a Saturn and Cancer person, the road back to recovery and healing is long. So these are some things to keep in mind and to self-reflect and to better understand. And at its bottom, the Saturn and Cancer person has to confront the fear of abandonment and challenge relentlessly, like the way Saturn can be relentless. Go and confront these internalized false beliefs about one's lack of worth and value. We have to introspect. And the blessing here is that it is in the sign of Cancer. That's what Cancer is about. That we can go within at some point in life when we're ready, and we can actually do an internal inventory of our inner landscape and understand these dynamics and rewire and reconfigure them. The brain has plasticity throughout life. We just have to be able to go in there, remold and reshape, but it requires us to go in. And Cancer will allow us to do that. Because Saturn and Cancer people can have a lot of love for other people. They can have a sense that other people are worthy of veneration, respect, love, care, warmth. But when it comes to themselves, they don't have that. They need to discover that within themselves for themselves as valuable beings also, because they too also exist. They too also matter. So these are, again, part of the life lessons for Saturn and Cancer. Sorry if my camera's shaking. I'm at this point leaning on the table fully and then rocking back and forth sometimes as a Saturn and Cancer would. And in fact, one of the keys into transforming that disorganized attachment style, which is never feeling safe and secure, is to come to understand this false belief about unworthiness within and this fear of abandonment. This introspection is very important for knowing how we can have emotional fulfillment and that we too matter. This is a life lesson here. Now, all of that said, do not mistake Saturn and Cancer people as doormats. You are sadly mistaken if you think that. And so far, our discussions could easily give someone the impression that Saturn and Cancer people are passive and they can just be doormats. We got to remember, not only we're talking about Cancer, which gives the native the ability to eventually do that introspection and understand their own needs, desires, feelings, and to be able to rewire themselves to meet those desires and needs. We also have Saturn here. So Saturn has a particular resiliency in it that it's unlike any other planet. So Saturn and Cancer people have surprising amount of resiliency. And I'll describe this in one of my own personal stories at the end, which is actually kind of funny to me now. They have a extraordinary amount of emotional endurance, which can be to their detriment, but it's still there. And they have emotional hardness in themselves too. Because we have to remember, Saturn is operating at the core of their internal being. It's still there. It doesn't mean just things happening to them. Things happening to them is also making them a certain kind of a person too, right? And we've got to remember, Saturn is anti-authority. Saturn is anti-establishment. And because of this, that child who went through all of that trauma, let's say, in their early childhood, it is not uncommon for them to see them become extremely rebellious in their adolescence and in later years in life as an adult. When the Saturn and Cancer person has a realization of the things that we're saying that are life lessons for Cancer, Saturn and Cancer person will also be the one who will coldly stand in front of that abusive partner and, excuse my French, and they'll say, get the fuck out. Just like that. Very cold. No explanation, no nothing, just out of here. So Saturn and Cancer people will not just lay there forever and ever and be stepped on either. So they can either work through their those imprints left on them to be able to feel love and to feel the security and to feel the self-worth. But if they get pushed too far too, some of its manifestation can come out as their hardness and their coldness also. I mean, going back to the adolescent years, I can testify to this. The Saturn and Cancer teenager will have a coup d'etat against their family. Suddenly, they will overthrow the regime that was suppressing and oppressing them and become super rebellious and anti-authority. And one of the things that, especially in adolescent years, embody and express internally is a sense of toughness. You can even see this in adulthood. Some of them seem almost, even though within they can have a lot of warmth and care, and they're always trying to like create a sense of harmony and keep things stable. Externally, they can come out as kind of being tough and unapproachable. That's coming from Saturn and Cancer. But it's important to remember where this is coming from. This is not coming from usually, especially in adolescent years where the person's still not aware of how they're functioning and what their operational system is, it's actually coming from a place of avoidance rather than a place of strength, because it's a defense mechanism. And it's actually made to protect them against feeling vulnerable, which comes from the pains that were experienced in early childhood generally. That's where it's coming from. And that sense of external hardness is like a shield that they wear that makes them almost even unapproachable, which is actually a shield to prevent other people seeing that deep-seated pain or fear of rejection or unworthiness that they've internalized throughout their life. It's a form of self-preservation, if nothing else. And by putting on this, like, let's say a tough demeanor and a tough exterior, they avoid the raw vulnerability that they felt, let's say, in childhood. And this doesn't let them feel like they're emotionally exposed. That hardness is protecting them emotionally. So it's about avoiding emotions in general. That's what that hardness is for. Because emotions have always equated to rejection. Emotions have always equated to volatility. It's like, why would I want to deal with that? So this protective shield is to avoid emotion and engagement with them. It's like, I'm going to keep you at an arm's length. We're not going to get all like lovey-dovey and huggy here. Say your part, I'll say my part. And they create a distance, right? And it comes out as being tough because they're able to maintain this distance also. But the problem is that this shields that they put on, it actually becomes a barrier in later life. And it's a skin that Saturn and Cancer people have to learn to shed at some point. And if they don't shed this, the healing process almost becomes impossible. Because true resiliency doesn't mean that one has to deny their emotions. It's about feeling it and then integrating it, for better or for worse, whatever the emotion is. Keeping it at an arm's length, it's not going to make us feel whole and settled and anchored. And that's what the Saturn and Cancer person actually wants. They want that security and safety. So they have to learn the lessons of vulnerability. And the thing is, a lot of Saturn and Cancer people, including myself, like when I look at my adolescence and young adulthood, I took this hardness and this emotional resiliency and this coldness. I could almost put on a poker face and there'll be like a murderous scene happening in front of me. And I'm just like, tough. I'm tough. But this is not emotional resiliency. It's actually suppression of emotion, is repression of emotions. And we can't come close to touching what the essence of ourself is when we're in that mode. Again, we're operating externally. We're not letting the water flow in the sign of Cancer. It's, I like to call Saturn and Cancer as like the method of making cosmic ice cubes. Everything's just becoming too solid and rigid. And emotions need to be fluid. We need to feel it. And it's like, without exhibiting intimacy also, how do we form healthy relationships? How do we get into healthy dynamics? So this hard skin, this shield that's made of lead, because that's what Saturn represents, it needs to be shed, put away at some point. Like this is an example of a child who's been emotionally neglected and rejected in their childhood, and they just become that proverbial tough guy or tough girl in their teenage years. And in their like social circus, it could be a circus, in their social circle, they're known as that tough person that you just don't mess with. And initially, Saturn and Cancer people will like this because it's a defense mechanism, as I was saying. And then they'll be noticed as someone, like the friends will be like, yeah, she doesn't need emotional support. She's so strong. She never needs anyone. She can handle anything without breaking. Like, how do you do that? I heard that so many times as not even a young person. I mean, like, I actually heard that recently. And I was like, oh my God, I'm still giving off that impression. It's actually good to have the world's feedback. Like, I still have that demeanor where people look at it like that. But internally, that's just on the surface, I guess, because internally, there are so many instances I have a feeling like, just hug me. Somebody just help me. Like, we're human. We all have that feeling. But externally, this is how a Saturn and Cancer people project themselves and externalize themselves. And the tragedy is they actually need to be hugged. They actually need to feel the love and the vulnerability. And that shield is preventing them from having that intimacy and that connection, which they actually truly and utterly need in this life. On the surface, because of this, like they can handle anything, they just exude confidence. Like nothing will break them and they're just in control and they know what they're doing. But beneath that facade, there's a lot of pain and fear, which the person actually needs help with, needs to be supported. They are not in control. They are in damage control at all time, but they are not in control. And another theme is that Saturn and Cancer people can feel very isolated and alone. And it is because of this. This has a lot to do with it. Because when you can't show vulnerability and you keep everybody at arm's length, how are you supposed to connect with them? How are you supposed to have intimate relationships also? So this contributes to that feeling of being distant, like Saturn at the edge of the solar system, the dimmest one, in the background, barely shining. So these become very prominent kinds of feelings for natives with this signature. And the healing process for this is to literally acknowledge I am vulnerable. I am scared. I need someone. I need help. I don't feel strong right now. I need a pillar to support me in this moment of life. And a Saturn and Cancer person cannot say, I need a pillar for the rest of my life. I always feel fear. It's fine, like in increments, to just confront the fact that this is a facade. This shield is a defense mechanism that's merely allowing you to survive, but it is not the means to thrive. So going to therapy, for example, talking to someone, a safe space where a Saturn and Cancer person who has not felt safe, they need to be in a safe space with a safe person to be able to verbalize these things and say them out loud. It's very important. And we're coming just to the end of the presentation, then I'll get into some examples. I don't even know how long this video is now. But in general, what is common with Saturn and Cancer, that signature, especially if the moon, which is the ruler of Cancer, is sitting in a sign that's not a friend sign, it's debilitated or it's in its fall or it's just getting crazy aspects, this signature can denote complex developmental trauma. And it's mostly related to the instability that they experience in their relational dynamics, especially intimate familial ones, during those critical early ages of life. And then, as discussed, this creates disorganized detachment. It is a detachment. Disorganized attachment style. It's a pervasive feeling of unworthiness, creates hypervigilance, repetition, compulsion, and fawning response that makes them highly attuned to other people's needs and kind of, let's say, ignorant to their own needs, unable to discern and decipher their own needs and what they need to do for their own well-being. And then these early childhood dynamics can set the blueprints, what I've been calling the impression and the pathways for future relationships and dynamics for a Saturn and Cancer person. And those neglects in the early years can normalize power imbalances in relationships. This is something I didn't get into in depth. I mean, there's so much to talk about. I have to draw the lines and the boundaries somewhere, right? Put the limitation cap somewhere. But these dynamics in early childhood also create or normalize very distorted power relations or imbalances, and it can also create codependency, and these things can also carry over to adult relationships. And when we get to the healing process or the life lessons and the struggles for a Saturn and Cancer person lies in understanding what it means to have healthy attachment style. This is one of the primary things, which becomes a way of working through the traumas that were experienced in earlier life and the reinforcement of those traumas in later relationships also, because this will allow someone to see the reoccurring relationship patterns that is just constantly being recreated over and over, which is deepening that wound that was initially created within them. And also, Saturn and Cancer people need to learn. You have Cancer there, I mean, Saturn there, but it's in the sign of Cancer. So this is not going to come naturally, but the native has to learn how to set proper and very strong boundaries. It's like, this is where my insight begins and ends. This is where your insight begins and ends. I need to protect what's within this fort. And once when I feel full and good, I will totally attend to you because I love you. But if I don't feel good, I can't attend to you. I need to attend to this universe first, and then I'll come to yours. So setting boundaries is very important. Cultivating a sense of self-worth that you are inherently valuable. You exist. This is not a small thing. You exist. You have a function in existence. Your existence has inherent value in that way. And in lives of other people, that sense of self-worth and value has to be cultivated, and it has to be almost ritualized so that it's internalized. And the Saturn and Cancer person has to become very familiar with, what are my deep emotions? What are my deep desires? What are my opinions? How do I want to express myself? How do I meet these needs? How do I meet these desires? I'm telling you, that hypervigilance makes a person so externally and other focused that it's very easy for a Saturn and Cancer person, before they cultivate these qualities, to know that they even have these needs and desires. They are at service of other people's needs and desires. Saturn represents subserviency, right? To even be a slave is represented by Saturn. We can become slave to other people's needs and emotions and neglect. Saturn is about neglect and negating our own, that's Cancer. Cancer represents the deep desires, opinions, needs, emotions, feelings. So we have to be able to develop that internal gaze to see what that is. We can easily lose awareness of that if we're not gazing at it and looking at it intentionally. In a sense, the Saturn and Cancer person is healing the inner child. That child that experienced, that had all those impressions and pathways made on it, that child expanded to an adult, but is living as an adult with those pathways that were conditioned within it. They need to be remapped, redrawn. They need attention. They need care, love, warmth, intimacy. So these are the things that a Saturn and Cancer person has to do in the path of stopping that emotional turmoil and to break the cycle of dysfunctional relationships, which comes from knowing their inherent self-worth and that they are good enough and that they are worthy of healthy relationships, and they have to cultivate this. This is not something you wake up in the morning and you're like, oh, I have self-worth, and from this day forth, my relationships will be healthy. It requires a lot of self-understanding, self-knowledge, and action with that knowledge, because knowledge without application, I think that's what we just call information, and it's just passing. But knowledge as wisdom that's embodied is because it's been practiced. So Saturn and Cancer people need to, when I say cultivation, is active. And Saturn has a sense of laziness to it, so we may not want to. We may want to avoid it, and we have a tendency towards avoidance, but we have to be able to act to create new imprints and pathways and to cultivate something new, a new way of being, because we can be that way in the world and within ourselves. And it's about creating a contract with oneself as a reference point. This is what I had to do. Create a contract where I operate based on what is mutual. It's not about being transactional, but it's about mutual love, mutual care, mutual respect, mutual emotional availability, mutual help. Because for Saturn and Cancer people, they can find themselves almost as I said, in a state of servitude, neglect themselves, find themselves completely depleted, For instance, when we love other people, one of our responsibility in that act of love is to take care of ourselves and to be these energized human beings full of vitality, not because we just want to be that human being, but because love requires a lot of action. So we have to be able to act it out every day. In loving another person, we have to be full. We have to be able to do that. So that terms of mutual as a reference point is saying that I will do this. I will give you this. However, I need my cup filled to be able to continue. And sometimes that filling requires mutual cooperation, mutual help. So this is something that I had to do for myself to be able to cultivate the consciousness for it, to be able to cultivate new pathways, to feel different and to act different, and then to get that feedback system and to strengthen it. So yeah, this is how I've gone about it. A lot of people talk about boundaries, but I feel like with Saturn and Cancer people, because that's like a very prominent thing of how to be in relationship. We have to be careful as Saturn and Cancer people because we can set boundaries and bring that hardness to the nth degree too. The point I would say for Saturn and Cancer people is to actually soften up. You know, Saturn's mantra talks about flowing waters. Saturn's greatest wish is to flow like the waters of a river. And we don't want to become a dam either. You know, it's already conditioned. Saturn and Cancer is already conditioning the slowing of water, that internal sense of how do I feel? What do I need? What are my feelings? We need to get in touch with that. That's part of the healing process for Saturn and Cancer people. And I'm going to end the presentation there. And then I wanted to give a couple of stories just to contextualize this. So on with the first story, which demonstrates both the negative aspects of the things that I'm talking about in the most benign way, where we would generally overlook this unless if we reflect and think about things. And at the same time, is showing the strength that can come from Saturn and Cancer. So this is in 2008. I was grappling and I would usually go to night classes, but one day I decided to go to a noon class. And the noon class was basically a dude class because they were all mostly fighters that were doing their conditioning for an upcoming fight or just more intense classes. And the instructor in that class was someone that I was definitely crushing on, and we were seeing each other. So after having done sprints, burpees, and sparring, and doing all the conditioning when you're already exhausted, at the end of the class, the drill was to get into a horse squat, lean against the wall, hold a medicine ball in front of us, the entire class. So there's four walls. There are all the fighters who are doing this and we're competing against each other. The winner is the person who drops the ball last. So imagine all of these fighters, prime, condition, all of them holding the ball one by one, they drop to the ground. The last two humans standing is me and the best of the best in the class. I am internally in pain. I'm like, my legs are shaking. I'm like, my head is like shaking. But in reflecting back, I remember what was preventing me from dropping that ball. And I'm like, I cannot drop that ball. I didn't want to keep the ball to win. I didn't give a shit about winning. What I cared about at that moment is that if I don't win this, the person that I had a crush on and dating, the instructor, would see me as something less than, that I'm not strong enough, that I'm not good enough. Like, good enough in relation to what? Relative to what? Like, what was that thought about? But that was the thought. And of course, I kept holding the ball till the other guy dropped to the ground. And I was the winner, but in my head, I was not the winner of that entire class and beating all these dudes. I was a person who was worthy and would not be rejected. That's how my mind was internalizing it. So we can see the negative aspect of Saturn and Cancer playing itself out. However, just because you don't want to be rejected, it doesn't mean that you can outplay and out endure all of these prime fighters and be the last human standing. There's an inner resiliency that could do that. There's just, it's like Saturn in Cancer can go to wars of attrition. So it has this endurance and it has this resiliency and it can just bear the pain. And this can become negative, as discussed earlier, but it's also a necessary quality in life because life is tough. Do you know how to tap into your inner resources and to pull out the last bit of energy and to still keep going? So the resiliency, that mental resiliency that was required in that moment, I was able to tap into it. But at the same time, when you look at what was fueling it, not healthy, right? To give another example, so I love my mother. She has done a lot for the family. But growing up, because of her own life circumstances, which was very Saturn and Cancer also, I had to attend to her emotions at all times. Like talking about that hypervigilance, it was developed in relation to my mother because it was hard to know how she was going to react. In my adult person now, in my adult mind, I can contextualize her situation and understand where she's coming from. But as a child, clearly I didn't have this ability. And there was this enormous and tremendous fear about how she would respond. And I remember I was probably around 6, and it was during the Iraq-Iran war. And as scheduled, because the bombers would come to bomb the city every night, the lights would go out around 7, I believe it was, 7 or 8. So she was having a bad night. And that particular night, I was very scared. Like, are they going to bomb us? Or is it going to be close to us? And I really needed her to give me emotional comfort. But I saw her walking around the house in the darkness with candles around, just murmuring stuff to herself, like she was very agitated. And I knew in that moment, it's like, okay, you need to shut up. You need to not say anything. And I just kept following her like a little puppy around the house till we found ourselves in the bathroom. And in the bathroom, she had a candle underneath the mirror. And then she cussed at somebody. And in that same moment, when she raised her voice and I'm standing behind her watching it, the mirror cracked. So in my child's mind, I couldn't put two and two together. That is the heat from the candle that has, it's what's causing the crack in the mirror. And my mind, I translated this as her enormous power and why I need to remain silent because she can even make mirrors crack. And it's kind of funny. It's not funny, but in reflecting back at it and reflecting on the archetype of how it reinforces itself to carve those pathways in the mind, you can even have these little mundane experiences. In a child's mind is everything because of that interpretation. In that moment, something got solidified in my mind. You never challenge her. Whenever she's feeling this way, you just need to be silent, especially after when the mirror cracked. Her first response to pay attention to me, and I interpreted that as because I was being good, because I didn't ask for anything. So these are the ways that the mind gets configured too, you know? And I wanted to talk about another thing that's more social. my generation, again, to carbon date myself, at the tail end of Generation X. And one of the prominent experiences of that generation, again, talking about the archetype, how it comes to solidify itself as life experiences and experiences of the self. Generation X was a generation, especially the tail end of it, where they're known as being the cohort where they were raised by the television. And why was that? Because both parents at that point in history, at that time, were going to work. They were not there to attend to the children. And if I tell you right now, what does it mean to have a key around your neck? You might not know, but people who were as part of Generation X, they will know a key around your neck, because all of us at school had a key around our neck. It was just like the thing to do, had become the style, key around your neck. And it was because you knew when you were leaving in the morning, most likely the parents were not home. And when you were coming back in the evening, your parents were not going to be home. And because we were kids, we were prone to losing our keys. So if the key was around your neck, you wouldn't leave it behind somewhere, right? And again, this concept, even generationally, of the fact that the parents were not there as that emotional feedback, as security, is contributing to this. When you're a child, I mean, like, think about watching a horror movie when you're in grade 2 compared to watching a horror movie today. You can laugh at some of it, but as a child, you don't understand. You actually need emotional supports. You have a lot of fears that are actually not based in reality. That's because you don't know enough about the world to connect the dots. So all those mysteries in between generates fear, for example. So kids who are left at home, who don't have that emotional feedback, who don't have that emotional response, who are not yet sure how to take care of themselves, but are forced to take care of themselves, that parentifying aspect of it is coming in, right? And I look at my peers, my good friends, we all have Saturn and Cancer. As Generation Xers, we have this tougher exterior, like we can handle anything. But again, it's a facade, it's a persona. Underneath it all, we're all like mashed potato. We're soft, we need love, we need everything that all other human beings need. But you can also see how this archetype, when it was its time, and Saturn and Cancer, we're also talking about a social time and an economic time that would entrench the signature of this archetype. It's interesting to see that. And then when we come to 2003 to 2005, with that generation, again, to talk about that emotional disconnection, this is also the same time where social media is being created, right? It's where internet is becoming very prominent. If my generation was raised by the television, this generation was raised by Facebook. That's when it was starting. It's detaching again from those social responses and those social feedbacks that actually gives you the proper feedback to understand how you feel on the inside, instead of just having that outward attention and gaze on the external and constantly gauging that. By the time you come back to yourself, you're kind of confused. You're like, is that my desire, or is that the desire that I'm seeing on the internet? The accessibility of it, it was very ever present in our lives. That's when it was getting set into motion. If you look at that time. So yeah, what I'm trying to say is that our personal lives with these archetypes unfold themselves as personal experiences, but there are also impersonal happenings that affect our experiences too. It's good to pay attention to that, especially as we get more to the outer planet, and even more so when we get to the generational planets like Uranus, Neptune, Pluto. Topic for another day, but just worth mentioning. And a last note before wrapping everything up, and I feel like this video is like 5 hours. I'm not sure. I don't have the time in front of me because I find that distracting. Saturn, trying to avoid Saturn. The last note is this. Sometimes we have very difficult signatures in our chart, and we could say that is part of our karma. But our karma is not, in my humble opinion, is not what is supposed to harm you. It is what's supposed to evolve you. So when I look at my chart with Saturn in Cancer, Moon in Aries, Saturn squaring my moon in Aries, whenever in Vedic astrology, whenever Saturn comes near my moon, I'm having a sati period where my moon, Saturn's debilitated and moon is sitting there. It's telling me what this karmic batch of this life is and what its evolution point is. As I've grown older, as I've become more mature, I've understood those early year experiences were creating a need simultaneously that had to get louder and louder. And then I would have to get to a point of my life where I would act upon them. And that is self-trust, self-reliance, activation, being able to act, and those Aries qualities of boldness, initiating, having initiative, had to be cultivated. This is something that I struggled with in my childhood because of the parental control that was over me. So I couldn't be a person who could act on my own behalf. In my teenage years, I became the person who acts on her own behalf in a rebellious way, but not in the right way. At the bottom of it, everything was fear-induced or fear-propelled. And it was not allowing me to have that individual expression that I wanted to have in this life. And as the years went by, the life lessons that unfolded for me is that how do I be my person? How do I express myself? And expression became a very prominent thing in my life. My moon sitting in the third house, for example, right? I remember the first time when we left Iran, my compulsion was to write a very long letter to my aunt to leave it in her pillowcase before leaving for good, expressing my pain and my sorrow in terms of how my mom was ripping me away from my extended family and my country. And it was that moment that created the propulsion to write. And now it is almost 40 years later, and that is what I do in life. I write. So it's like that Saturn in Cancer, the pain was what allowed me to tap into this writing. And what was going to unfold for many decades to come, and I don't know how much more time ahead in terms of how much time I have and for how long I want to be engaged with this, that compulsion or propulsion stays. But it's we have to accept, this is what I'm trying to say, not even that we have to accept, we will come to accept, hopefully, that these harder signatures in our chart have a purpose that's pointing to our evolution as a human being, as a soul, however way you conceptualize these ideas. It is not in vain. It is not just to suffer. We're going to suffer, but we're suffering to get to the root and to the depth of something much greater and more important that's necessary for our growth in this life. So I just wanted to leave you with that. And without further ado, here's a video montage. that's it for now, and I'll try to connect other planets to signs that have more difficulties with them, such as debilitations and planetary falls, or when we have very difficult conjunctions. It's good to ponder these and understand how they can unfold throughout a lifetime, what kind of experiences they can denote, and how we can grapple with them, most importantly, because we're experiencing them. And with Saturn in Cancer, as I think I said at the beginning of the video, this also pertains to squares and oppositions to where your moon or the sign of Cancer, how it's connecting through these kinds of aspects, and or at least some themes will emerge. And I think that's it for today. Thank you for listening. Much love. Till next time.